Well, 21 years ago, I was a struggling intern at a church in Louisville, Kentucky, saving every dime I could to buy an engagement ring to ask the woman of my dreams to be my wife. And in April of 1998, that first mission was accomplished, and now I had to take the drive from Louisville to Lexington to meet with her mom and dad, and I went there and had a meal around their table to ask their permission, their blessing to marry their daughter. And I don't remember what we ate. I'm not sure I ate anything because I was afraid I was going to throw up at any minute. And but you know, I thought I had an idea of how this conversation was going to go. I mean, I had a good relationship with her mom. Her dad, I wasn't quite sure. I hadn't spent as much time with him, but her mom was completely thrown off by this conversation. Like, she didn't see it coming, and she thought Janelle was too young to be married, but clearly I was a good catch, and so there was tension that she was wrestling with there. Her dad, however, was ready to get her off the payroll, so he was all for it. So I drove away with their blessing. I proposed a few days later. The biggest decision of my life was hashed out around a table, enjoying a meal together with other people. And that's what happens around the table. It's not just a place to eat, it's a place to relate. It's not just a place to consume, it's a place to connect. It's a place where love grows and where stories get told and where values get shaped and where relationships get deepened, where truth gets extended and grace gets received. All right, we're kicking off a new series today called A Meal with Jesus. So we're going to gather around this table for the next 8 or 9 weeks to walk through the occasions in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus had a meal with somebody or with a group of people. And it was never about the food. It was always about the fellowship. It wasn't about the meal itself. It was about the meaningful conversations that came out of that. For Jesus, the table was an opportunity to share more than just food. It was an opportunity to share hope and grace and truth and promise and ultimately transformation. And I bet the same is true for your table. If you think about the time spent around your table, there probably aren't a ton of meals that stand out, even though there were lots of good ones. What stands out are the conversations that were had, the decisions that were made, the relationships that were deepened. I've had my kitchen table up on stage before, so some of you know this, but our table that sits in our kitchen at home, I turned 1 on it. Had my first birthday on that table. There's a picture of me in the middle of the table just going crazy on a cake, and it's all over me. And both of my boys had their first birthday on that table. So I'm in my 45th year with that table. That's a lot of meals, but that's a lot of conversations. Like, a lot of who I am was shaped around that table, sitting with people speaking into me and encouraging me and sharing truth with me. See, food connects us and fosters an environment for relationship. And Jesus leveraged that to the absolute fullest. Luke 19:10 tells us why he came. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. That was the mission of Jesus. Like, his purpose was to come and to reconcile us back to the Father. His purpose was to come and show us how to live a life that honors the Father and draw us back into relationship with the Father. That was his purpose. But then in Luke chapter 7, it tells us his practice. The Son of Man came eating and drinking. This is a statement of mission. This is a statement of method. This is how Jesus was going to accomplish this mission. And ultimately, you know, our salvation was won on a cross, not around a table. But if you've been here for a while, I hope you have picked up on the idea that a relationship with Jesus is more than just about where you're going when you die. It's about what you're doing while you live. And the conversations that he has around a table give us a window into how to live well. See, eating and drinking isn't just about nourishment, it's about relationship. It's not just about consuming, it's about community. And Jesus used the table to teach us about the love and the goodness and grace of God. And he does that all throughout the Gospel of Luke. You see, if he's not eating in the Gospel of Luke, he is telling a story about food, like the great banquet in Luke 14, or the celebration of the prodigal son who came home in Luke chapter 15. The Pharisees even call him a glutton and a drunkard because he's either at the table or at a party with the wrong crowd. See, meals were integral in the mission of Jesus because in the ancient world, sharing a meal was a sign of welcome, a sign of hospitality, a sign of friendship. And the people that Jesus sat around the table with weren't the typical church crowd. They weren't welcomed by many people. They weren't shown hospitality by many people. They didn't share friendship with many people. They were usually people who were beat down, cast out, and overlooked. So there's something bigger going on than beef Wellington. There's something bigger going on than cedar plank salmon here in these stories. Jesus is ushering in something brand new. It's a brand new day. It's a brand new kingdom. It's a brand new way to connect with God. Peter Leithart, in his book, Blessed Are the Hungry, he says this, for Jesus, feast was not just a metaphor for the kingdom. As Jesus announced the feast of the kingdom, he also brought it into reality through his own feasting. Unlike many theologians, he did not come preaching an ideology, promoting ideas, or teaching moral maxims. He came teaching about the feast of the kingdom, and he came feasting in the kingdom. Jesus did not go around merely talking about eating and drinking. He went around eating and drinking a lot. Meals with Jesus are a window for us into the heart of God. And it allows us to look in as we get into these conversations. It gives us a window in to see that everybody's invited and everybody's welcome. There are no unwanted or unwelcome guests at the table of Jesus. Let's jump into this first meal in Luke chapter 5, beginning in verse 27. It says, after this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting in his tax booth. Follow me, Jesus said to him, and Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. Then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to his disciples, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? Jesus answered them, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. See, the reason that the Pharisees have a conflict with Jesus is because Jesus has a conflict with religion. If you have a problem with religion, then Jesus is your guy. You have more in common with Jesus than you might think, because Jesus came to put an end to religion. There's only one religion that was given to man by God. All other religions are man-made. God gave one religion to man. Specifically, he gave the religion of Judaism to the nation of Israel. And it had both a purpose and a period. Something it was intended to accomplish and a time which it was intended to end. And so God gave Israel a system that included a specific diet code, sacrifices, holy days, fasting days, all for the purpose of preparing the world for the coming of Jesus through prophecy and through promise. God did not relate with the rest of the world. He only related to the nation of Israel. So there was a strict code of ethic and behavior given to them on how to relate to this holy God while they were waiting on the Messiah. And so the temple was a religious place set up to maintain a relationship with God through animal sacrifice that was used to atone for sin and to remind the nation that there was a barrier that existed between them and God because of sin. And so it took a great deal of effort to connect with God. It took a great deal of effort to be in relationship with God, and that was intentional. Because God was showing Israel and eventually showing us through the nation of Israel, through this preserved text, on how severed the relationship really was and how ultimately God's grace would be so amazing when Jesus would finally come. The temple model was meant to be temporary. Did that come out right? The temple model was meant to be temporary. You try saying that. Temple model was meant to be temporary, okay? The temple model was meant to be temporary. Jesus came as a permanent priesthood that would draw all men back to God through his sacrifice, ending the religion and restoring the relationship with God. Jesus intended to replace Judaism. Jesus was the purpose and Jesus was the period, but something happened between the period of the Old Testament and the New. There was a 400-year period where God was silent, and during that time, a group of men called the separated ones evolved, and their job was to protect the temple model, to protect the religion, to protect the law, and they became dogmatic and even legalistic and actually put their own brand on the religion. It would be like you going away for 10 years and you had somebody come in and house sit for you, and their job was to protect your house. It was to maintain your house. You didn't give them permission to change it. But over time, that's kind of what they did. They started to take some creative liberties. You left it looking like a Pottery Barn magazine, but they had a little more Gothic flair to them. Right? And 10 years later, you come back to Gothic, you come back to your house, and they don't know who you are. They don't recognize you. You've changed, and you start trying to take the house back. You start trying to open it up to everybody, and they just think you're trying to steal their house. That's what this group of men did. We know them as the Pharisees. They were stewards of the house. They were stewards of the religion. They were entrusted to maintain the house until the Messiah would come, but they made it into something that it was never intended to be. They put their own stamp on it, and when Jesus shows up, they didn't know who he was. They didn't recognize him as the Messiah, and Jesus is trying to take back the house, and he's inviting a bunch of people who don't belong in the house, and they're not having any of it. In fact, Jesus tells a parable about this in Luke chapter 20 called the parable of the tenants. Judaism had become contaminated and corrupted from what it was intended to be and from what it was intended to do. And we see that play out all throughout the Gospels as Jesus interacts with the Pharisees. It's always a tense interaction, and it happens four times in the chapter 5 of Luke. In verses 12 through 16, Jesus heals a leper by touching him. That's against the rules. You can't touch a leper or you'll become unclean, but you can if you're God in the flesh. And he was, and so he does. And the Pharisees protest. They throw the yellow flag out. In verses 17 through 26, he heals a crippled man and he forgives sin. But that's against the rules. You can't forgive sin unless you're God, but Jesus was. And so he does. And the Pharisees protest. In verses 33 through 39, the Pharisees call him out because his disciples aren't fasting like their disciples. And they said, your disciples go on eating and drinking. That's against the rules. And Jesus says, no, that's against your rules. That's your house. That's not my house. When God is with man, they don't fast. They feast. And I am God. And I am with them. And so we are feasting. And then he tells them this parable of the wineskins. You've probably heard this parable. He says, you can't put new wine in old wineskins. The reason is because new wine has to ferment. And when it ferments, it'll burst the skin of an old wineskin. New wine has to be put in fresh wineskin. And so in verse 39 of chapter 5, Jesus diagnoses the problem. And no one, after drinking old wine, wants the new. For they say the old is better. The old is better. Have you ever heard in church, we have never done it that way? Here's what they're saying. The old is better. The old is better. Here's what Jesus is saying. I'm bringing in something brand new. I am ushering in a brand new kingdom. I am ushering in a brand new way of thinking. I am ushering in a brand new way with connecting with God by grace through faith, and it does not fit with your way of connecting with God through rule keeping. My new covenant of grace is going to break your old covenant of law. And that was always meant to be the case. That was the design from the beginning. I was to be the period. Remember what Jesus said? I came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Right? When something is fulfilled, what does that mean? It's done. It's finished. Jesus fulfilled the law, and he says, you're going to go on drinking that wine, that old wine, because you just can't imagine drinking anything else. See, Jesus touches a leper. You know why? Because that's what grace does. Jesus heals a crippled man and forgives his sin. You know why? That's what grace does. And then in verse 27 through 32, he invites a tax collector to leave his career and follow him into something better because that's what grace does. See, here's what grace does. It flies in the face of religion. Grace flies in the face of religion. And this is why all of us struggle with grace a little bit. I mean, every one of us. We struggle with grace because all of us have drank old wine, right? Everybody has a little religion in them. You got a little religion in you. I got a little religion in me. We want to revert back to old wine. This is why your friends and family, by the way, if you've ever tried to share Jesus with them and you received resistance or they were offended, this is why. You're trying to talk to them about the saving grace of Jesus and how it's a free gift made available to everyone who comes to him by faith, and it's only by faith that you are saved and hell is a permanent reality. I mean, who doesn't like free stuff? How is that offensive? Here's why. Because they're good people. They're good people. And goodness is religious. They have used their goodness, or they're making their goodness the condition on which they're saved. That is religion. Like, you're telling me that unless I confess Jesus as Lord, I'm not saved? What about all the good things I've done? That's religion. Jesus is doing something brand new. Right? Your goodness is never enough to even the scales. The good things that we do are never enough to be saved, and we don't need to, because grace trumps goodness. It's extended to everyone who will call on the name of Jesus. But grace, the problem is it flies in the face of religion. People who've been drinking old wine don't want to drink anything new. And for those of us who've confessed Jesus as Lord and we've been saved by grace through faith, we oftentimes we go back to that religion. We go back to that old wine because we all have a little religion in us. If you think God is upset with you, if you're a follower of Jesus right now, you think God is upset with you because of a decision that you made, that's religion. It's not grace. God is fine with you. The cross made it so. What did he say? It is finished, fulfilled, period. You and God are good. If you give because you think God is going to give you something in return, that's religion. It's not grace. If you serve or you're in a Bible study because you think that's the Christian thing to do, that's religion, that's not grace. See, here's what religion does. It makes demands of us. But grace just compels us. Religion makes demands of us, but grace just compels us. I don't serve because I have to. I serve because I'm compelled to. I don't give because I have to. I give because I'm compelled to. Like many of you, Janelle and I made a sacrificial offering to the Unfinished campaign. We didn't do that because we had to. We do it because grace compels us, that we want more and more people to know that grace. We want everybody to know that there is a seat at the table, and in order for them to know there's a seat at the table, there's got to be a seat in the room. So they can hear about this grace, so they can hear about this God who came to put an end to religion and give something brand new and do something brand new and give something absolutely free. That's what Unfinished is all about. That's why we're building a bigger worship center. Because grace compels us to create space. Grace compels us to create space. And let me just say this. I'm only going to say it to this service because it doesn't matter about the other two. Look around. Ain't many seats in here. Plenty at 8:30. Plenty at 11:30. So let me just plead with you. If you have the flexibility, if your kids aren't connected to a small group during this hour, you've got the flexibility. We need your seat. Come to 8:30, come to 11:30. If you have the flexibility to do that, I don't care if you do it out of grace or religion, just come. If you go, Shawn, I just have to, great, I'll take it. But seriously, man, let grace compel you. What can I do to help create space? Because most of our guests, they come to this service. And there's nowhere to sit. I sit back in the room for 10 minutes today just watching people flood in. There was plenty of room at 10 o'clock when we started the service. Just an observation. What does grace compel you to do to help us reach this vision of double impact? I mean, that's the vision that we've set in place, a 5-year vision that is now down to 3.5 years to reach double impact. That's why we created 3 services while we're waiting for this building. But we got to have room in this. We got to have space right here. So I'll get off that soapbox. Just before this story of Levi, Jesus gives a man physical legs to walk in the middle of his paralyzed condition. And he comes to Levi and he gives him spiritual legs to walk in the middle of his rebellious condition. See, just like a leper and a paralytic would have been the lowest of the low on the physical scale in Israel, a tax collector was the lowest of the low on the moral scale in Israel. They were Jews who worked for Rome, and Rome was enemy number 1. And any Jew that worked for Rome was considered a traitor. And if you think your taxes are bad, man, Rome taxed everything. There were port taxes and road taxes and market taxes and animal taxes and taxes on the number of wheels that you had on a cart, you name it, they taxed it. And the tax collector's job was to collect the tax collector, from the people. And so when you would enter into a town, there would be a tax collector there meeting you, getting your tax for coming in. And Rome basically gave tax collectors carte blanche authority to set the tax rate. The only condition is you have to give us our cut. And here's our cut. It's fixed. All right, but anything above that is up to you. And so tax collectors were dishonest. They were unfair. They were the most hated people in all of Israel. And Jesus, a Jewish rabbi, goes to a tax collector and says, "Follow me." And Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. Like Jesus said to the paralytic, "Get up, take up your mat, and go home." And he did. And then he stands in Levi's tax office in the middle of tax season while he's laying on his tax mat, paralyzed by his tax sin, paralyzed by his greed, paralyzed by his deceit, paralyzed by his sin. And he says, "Follow me." And Levi got up. And he walked with Jesus. And one verse later, he becomes an evangelist for all of his tax-loving friends. He uses his money because tax collectors were wealthy. He leverages his money and he throws a party for Jesus at his house because he just had to. It was just the right thing to do. No. Grace compelled him. Religion makes demands of us, but grace just compels us. And Levi, compelled by God's grace, said, "Jesus, my money is yours, my house is yours, my life is yours." And all of Levi's rowdy friends came over that night. And where was Jesus? Right in the middle of the dance floor, doing the electric slide. Can you believe it? Scandalous. He did not do the Macarena. Too much hip action in that. And everybody's having a good time. but the Pharisees. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to his disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" We've never done it that way. We've never done it that way. See, the temple model of religion said holy men don't dine with unholy men. That was a protest of the Pharisees. That's against the rules. But Jesus wasn't just a holy man. He was a holy God who was sending a message to everyone present. And you and I are present, right? We're at this party, sending a message to everyone present that everyone's welcome. I mean, Jesus was just gracing all over their religion. Just gracing all over the place. And they didn't like it one bit. And the reason they didn't like it is because they were true to their name. They were the separated ones. And friends, this is what so many churches have become. A group of holy people who've separated themselves from the rest of the world. Right, and we've created this Christian subculture, and we live in our Christian community, and we do life with our Christian friends, and we go on vacation with our Christian friends, and we do business with Christian companies, and we go on Christian cruises, and we listen to Christian music, and there's nothing inherently wrong with all that. Don't hear all that. I've got a kid in Christian school, so I'd be the pot calling the kettle black. My point is this: we have to be careful because we can easily become the separated ones. I heard a statistic recently that most Christians don't share Christ with their unchristian friends after 2 years. You know why? They don't have any. They've been Christianized, separated. And I'm telling you, nothing is more unbiblical. Nothing is more unchristian. Nothing is more unlike Jesus. See, the Pharisees asked his disciples. They didn't ask Jesus, they asked his disciples, but look who answers. Jesus answered them. It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. There is no us and them with me. Like the mission of Judaism was to produce a Messiah whose mission would be to bring people back to God. See, God gave one religion to one nation so that he could send one man to provide grace for everyone. All are invited to this party. All are invited to this table. And grace flies in the face of religion. Religion has a problem with free grace. It just can't comprehend it. And so if you don't have someone in your life right now that you're investing in, that you're building a relationship with, someone who doesn't know Jesus, that you're starting to pour into and pray for, grace may be flying in your face. Grace may be too scandalous for you. You may be having a collision with Christ and religion. Jesus may be gracing on you right now because he wants you to grace on other people. And this is the whole reason behind our effort for the one this year. It is all we've been pounding on, that everybody needs someone. Everyone needs to have someone there leading to the only one who can save anyone. And if you're a follower of Jesus, this is the mission. And when we think about double impact, that can happen overnight. If everyone has someone that they're leading to the only one who can save anyone. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have Christian friends or go on Christian vacations or listen to Christian music. Don't hear that. What I'm saying is, don't become a separated one. Don't completely withdraw yourself from the world. See, influence requires engagement. Influence requires engagement. We have to be willing to get close to people who don't look like us, don't talk like us, don't think like us, don't believe like us, and heaven forbid, don't behave like us. And if you want to look like Jesus, if you want a ministry like Jesus, here's what you got to do. You got to throw a party. You got to throw a party like Jesus. Don't have to. That's religion, but grace. And grace just compels us to show grace and to share grace with others. And the best way to do that is around a table, sharing a meal, just building relationship. Just loving people. It worked for Jesus. And if we're willing to get uncomfortable and drink a little new wine, it could work for us. Brennan Manning was an author who passed away several years ago, but he wrote a book called Ragamuffin Gospel. And he was a man who, he was a priest, but he didn't really fit in with the stereotypical church crowd. He was a man who had been graced on and who knew and understood grace like nobody else. And he wrote this book called Ragamuffin Gospel. That the gospel is for all the ragamuffins. And I love this quote near the end of his book, and I've shared it before, but it's worth hearing again. He says, "Here is a revelation as bright as the evening star." And it should be obvious, right? It should be obvious, but it's a revelation to us that Jesus comes for sinners. For those outcasts as tax collectors and for those caught up in squalid choices and failed dreams. He comes for corporate executives, street people, superstars, farmers, hookers, addicts, IRS agents, AIDS victims, and even used car salesmen. I didn't write it, I'm just reading it. Jesus not only talks with these people, but dines with them. These are the sinner guests invited by Jesus to closeness with him around the banquet table. And these are we. The corporate executives, the street people, the superstars, the farmers, the tax collectors, and all of us who've been caught up in squalid choices and failed dreams. Jesus came to grace on us and to invite us to his table to share a meal. And we're going to do that right now. In fact, we do it every week. For those of us who follow Jesus, we have a time of communion in our service, and it's a time where we have a meal together. It's just a small piece of bread and a small cup of juice. It's symbolic of the last meal that Jesus had with his followers, his disciples, where he ushered in this new covenant. Where he ushered in this new covenant of grace that would trump the old covenant of law. That would ultimately say, everybody's invited, everybody's welcome. And so as you take communion today, you remember that grace begets grace. That grace received is to be grace extended. That we did nothing to be made right before God. That there's nothing we could do to be made right before God. God did it all. God set the table. He served up the dinner. You and I, all we have to do is pull up a seat and feast. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this simple reminder of the grace you've poured all over us. And I pray today that we would receive your grace in a fresh way, and that it would compel us in a new way. To extend the grace to others that we have so bountifully received. We pray that your grace would flow freely out of us to others. In Jesus' name.